That morning, just as I sat down at my desk, my phone started vibrating violently. It was a call from Charles, my husband's best friend. I answered. His voice was rushed and urgent. "Your husband was in a car accident. Come right away." My heart felt like it was about to leap out of my chest. When I arrived at the emergency department, thankfully, he had already passed the critical stage. 3 days later, while my husband was sleeping, the head nurse secretly slipped a piece of paper into my hand. "Don't come anymore. Check the camera. He's faking it." At that moment, I was half believing, half doubting. I decided to install a hidden camera in his room. But what I saw, what I heard, left me frozen. A terrifying scheme was about to collapse on me, and he wasn't doing it alone. But before I tell you what that scheme was, and why it shocked me so deeply, please hit the like button and comment below with the name of the city you're living in. I'll tell you right now. My name is Gianna, 35 years old, and I'm a pediatric dermatologist at Harborview Medical Center. It was just past 8 that day when I was examining my first patient, a newborn with flushed, itchy skin, crying with a reddened face. After the exam, I concluded it was only atopic dermatitis, gave the parents care instructions, and was about to move on to the next case when my phone rang. It was Charles, Christian's best friend, and also an orthopedic surgeon at Swedish. His voice was urgent. "Your husband's been in a car accident, both legs broken. Come now, ER, Swedish hospital." I remember nearly dropping my pen. My heart pounded wildly. I rushed to ask my department head for emergency leave, ran straight to the parking lot, phone in hand, not knowing how many times I called Christian. When I arrived at Swedish, the sight of both his legs fully casted made me burst into tears right at the emergency room door. I asked immediately why he hadn't been transferred to Harborview, the hospital with a stronger trauma specialty where I placed far more trust. Christian took my hand, his voice weak but strangely calm. "I feel safer here. Charles is treating me himself." At that moment, I believed him completely. There was no reason to doubt my husband or his best friend. I had no idea that the words "feel safer" that day would mark the beginning of everything that would drag me into a truth far more painful than any injury I'd ever treated in a child. For 3 days straight, I sat by Christian's bedside, only stepping away for absolutely necessary work. I wiped his hands, straightened the blanket each time it slipped, and tried to keep calm by reminding myself that he was still alive, that everything would be okay. On the third night, Christian lay there sleeping, both legs thickly casted, the heart monitor beeping steadily in a room lit only by the faint yellow light seeping through the door. At around 11:30 p.m., head nurse Sarah came in for a checkup, but something was different. She paused longer than usual, her eyes flickering from me to Christian, as if she wanted to say something, but couldn't. Seeing him still asleep, Sarah leaned over, like she was adjusting something on my hand. But instead, she secretly slipped a note into it, then turned quickly away, leaving behind only the lingering scent of antiseptic in the air. I lowered my head onto the bed, pretending to sleep. I opened the note, my hand trembling so badly that the words blurred before my eyes. Just one short line, but it froze my blood. "Don't come back." Check the security footage from last night. 3 a.m. He's faking. I looked up at Christian, still motionless, his breath steady, his face calm to a strange degree. For the first time in all those days, I didn't look at my husband through the eyes of a desperate wife. I looked at him like a stranger, a person I had to reread in every detail to know who he truly was. I began to observe. Christian's breathing showed no signs of the constriction that comes with pain. No reflexive leg jerk when the brace was accidentally bumped. No trembling, no muscle tension, no spasms in the thigh. None of the signs of severe trauma. Everything was textbook acting. A chilling horror clenched my chest. I gripped Sarah's note and stepped out into the hallway, and I realized one thing. I couldn't just walk up to the front desk and ask for the security footage. Those were internal records. The hospital wouldn't release them to family without a court order, And if Sarah had chosen to warn me, it meant someone inside this hospital wasn't safe. I couldn't ask Charles either. He was Christian's attending physician. He was Christian's best friend. He was the only one holding the key to the entire truth. If Charles was part of this, then I was trapped in a web that only I didn't know existed. I clutched Sarah's note tighter, feeling like I was clinging to a rope stretched between truth and an abyss. After some reasoning, I came to one conclusion. If I wanted to see footage, I had only one option: install my own camera. No one in the hospital could help me. No official process was safe enough. It was just me and my instincts. Then fear crept in. If I installed a camera, it meant I was suspecting my own husband, a man I'd slept beside for the past 10 years, a man lying paralyzed right in front of me. What if I was wrong? What if it was just a misunderstanding? What if Sarah had misread something? Was I becoming a controlling wife? At the very moment my husband was in the most pain. The next morning, just as the first sunlight slanted through the hospital room window, I stepped into the hallway with Sarah's note in my pocket, my heart pounding like it wanted to burst from my chest. I turned toward the small retail area in the hospital lobby where they sold gear for patients' families and bought a micropin camera, 7-day battery life, complete with video and audio connected directly to an app on my phone. I never imagined I'd be installing a camera to spy on my own husband. Just holding that tiny device in my hand made me feel nauseated, heartbroken, and so furious I could barely breathe. But reason one: I needed the truth. And sometimes, the truth doesn't come from the people we love, but from emotionless things like a camera the size of a pinky finger. When two nurses wheeled Christian out for an X-ray to check on the injury, I had about 7 minutes alone in the room. I quickly pulled out the bouquet I'd bought that morning. Sunflowers, the kind Christian always said were too garish, but I chose them precisely because they hid the camera well. I slipped the device between the petals, angled the lens toward the hospital bed, adjusted the view to cover the bed, the casted legs, and the room door. I tested the connection. The screen lit up clearly. 1080p, audio streaming. Just that alone made my heart race so hard, my hands trembled. Christian was wheeled back in just as I was repositioning the bouquet. He winced as if in unbearable pain, but when he saw me, he immediately pressed his lips together, toning the pain down to the level of a considerate man who didn't want to worry his wife. I walked over and tried to speak as naturally as possible. I need to go back to Harborview for a bit. It's packed with patients today. They're short on doctors. Christian widened his eyes slightly, as if surprised. You're leaving me alone? I'm in so much pain. But just a second later, he changed his tone, softened it in a strangely deliberate way. Never mind. Go. I can handle it. The kids need you more. A line that sounded noble, but felt like a rehearsed script. The Christian I knew would have done anything to keep me by his side. But this Christian let me go so easily it sent chills down my spine. I left the room, hurried down the hall, but instead of heading to the elevator that led to the parking lot, I turned and sat down at a small cafe on the ground floor of Swedish. Setting my cappuccino on the table, I took out my phone and opened the camera app. The screen was black for a moment. Then the image came into focus. Christian's hospital room, silent and empty. Just the sunflower bouquet in the corner by the bed. The audio kicked in. I felt my hands shake so badly I had to use both to keep the phone from falling to the floor. I stared at the screen like it was a doorway to somewhere I wasn't sure I wanted to go, but I had to look. I had to know. The phone screen lit up, and for the first few seconds, all I could hear was the steady hum of the air conditioner in the quiet hospital room. I stared at the image of Christian sleeping, both legs casted and perfectly positioned, the blanket pulled up to his chest. Everything so flawless, it looked like a pre-staged movie scene. Then, exactly 15 minutes later, the unimaginable happened. Christian opened his eyes. Not drowsily like someone in pain, but wide, alert, with not the slightest sign of grogginess. He sat up smoothly, using his hands, without groaning, without a grimace, without even a reflex of pain. Then he bent down, slipped both hands under the cast, and pulled off the entire leg brace as if removing an empty sleeve. I couldn't breathe. My whole body froze. I didn't dare blink, afraid that if I did, what I was seeing would vanish like a nightmare. But no. He turned his legs, placed them on the floor, stood up, and walked. Normally. Straight, steady, not a single tremble or limp. In that moment, it felt like someone had shut off all the lights inside my chest. Suddenly, the past 3 days came rushing back, sharp and clean, like a blade. I remembered the first night beside Christian's bed. He barely spoke, lying motionless, eyes tightly shut as if completely drained. Only when I called his name would he open his eyes for a beat, then immediately close them again, as if writhing in pain. Every time I left the bed to get water, adjust the heater, or just step into the hallway, he lay completely still, not a sound. But every time I returned and stood by his side, he would furrow his brow right at that moment, then let out a soft moan, just enough to twist my heart, but not loud enough to warrant calling a nurse. Now, looking back, I knew that wasn't the reaction of someone suffering. It was the reflex of someone who knew exactly how his wife's empathy worked. As I tried to swallow the lump rising in my throat, Christian pulled out his phone on screen, dialed a number, and spoke clearly into the camera's mic. "Yeah, come in. Room's clear." A woman's voice replied, young, soft, familiar, but I didn't dare say her name. 30 minutes later, the hospital room door opened. Brittany walked in. No knock, no hesitation. She walked straight to Christian's bed as if this were her own home. Christian smiled. A smile I hadn't seen him give me in months. Brittany sat beside him, leaned into his hair, whispered something that made him chuckle softly. In that instant, I felt my heart constrict. My stepmother, the woman who once called me daughter, was now draped in the expression of a longtime lover toward my husband. I wondered how long it had been, and how I had become the last to know the truth. The camera captured everything: the rustle of the blanket, their laughter, their whispers close to each other's ears, every word so clear it made my hands tremble. Then Christian said something that made me nearly drop my phone to the cafe floor. "Gianna's starting to worry. Push a little more." I felt my heart shatter into hundreds of pieces. Brittany replied, voice cold as steel, "Once the farm sells, we're fine. Just keep acting." Then Christian gave a dry laugh and said something that chilled my entire body. "If we don't sell the farm, it's over. I can't pay the debt. She has to believe I'm about to be crippled." Brittany answered, "Scare her with the hospital bills. Say insurance won't cover. Make her offer to sell it herself." Every vague line from the past 2 days suddenly became sharp as scripted dialogue from a film I didn't even know I was in. Christian had once softly said, "I'm scared. If I can't walk again, how will we survive?" Brittany had sighed, calculating, "Rehab is expensive. What if insurance won't pay everything?" Back then, I believed them. I was sleep-deprived, exhausted, terrified. And in that fragility, every word they said was like a needle pricking my mind, planting fears about money. But now, seeing Christian walk with ease and Brittany by his side, I understood. It was all a rehearsed script. Not a single word was real. The door opened again. Charles walked in. He wasn't surprised at all to see Christian sitting upright, talking to Brittany. No questions, no shock from a doctor, who just saw his paralyzed patient standing. He placed a hand on the medical file and said quietly, "I've updated the records. Once she signs the sale contract, we're done." Immediately, I remembered that morning, day 3, when Christian said, "The insurance came, but only partially." I asked how much, which parts, where's the email? He turned away, sighed, still waiting on a reply. It's complicated. Then Charles came in, interrupting with vague professional jargon. These types of injuries take forever to recover. A lot isn't covered under emergency care. I didn't see it then, But now I saw it all. They spoke like men who had agreed on a script long ago. On the screen, they stood together, Christian, Brittany, and Charles, a trio functioning smoothly, like gears in the same machine. When Brittany left, Christian lay back down, slipped the fake cast into place, adjusted the leg brace carefully, then closed his eyes. Within 10 seconds, he had turned back into the severely injured patient. And I understood, layer by layer. There was no real injury, no real insurance, no medical expenses, no accident at all. There was only me, a wife being cornered into a calculated performance, written solely to push me into selling the only asset my grandfather left me. I turned off the phone screen, but my hands were still shaking so much I couldn't close my fist. My heart pounded like it wanted to explode out of my chest. My whole body was freezing cold, as if yanked backward from a cliff I wasn't prepared to look down from. I stood up and left the cafe in a daze, walking without knowing where I was going, only knowing that I had to get away from Swedish Hospital, away from that room full of lies, before I suffocated. I thought of the one person I could still call family, my father, Alexander. As terrible, drunk, and cold as he might be, he was still my father. At least, that's what I told myself to avoid feeling completely alone in that moment. I drove almost automatically, and when I finally stopped, I found myself standing in front of his house. I took a deep breath, climbed the steps, and knocked. Alexander opened the door after a few staggering footsteps. The stench of alcohol hit me immediately. His eyes were bloodshot, his face hollow, hair matted. He looked at me like a stranger, not like his only remaining daughter. "What are you doing here?" His voice slurred, heavy with booze. I couldn't hold it in anymore. Everything burst at once. "Dad! Christian wasn't in an accident. He can walk. He's acting. And Brittany. Dad! Brittany and him. They—" My voice broke, cracking between sobs I tried to hold back. Alexander frowned, then suddenly screamed, as if I had insulted the holiest thing in his life. "You're tearing my family apart. Don't make up lies to ruin Brittany." I stepped back, stunned. "Dad, I'm not making it up. I have video." Christian stood up, took off the brace, walked like nothing happened. Brittany came into the room. "They might—" "Shut up!" Alexander screamed so loudly the neighbors probably heard. He pointed a shaking finger in my face, trembling from the alcohol. "Brittany's the only decent person left in my life. Don't ruin her, too." I opened my mouth to say more, but then Alexander blurted out something no child should ever have to hear. "You're the reason your mother died. You wanted piano lessons. You made her take that extra shift, and she died because of you." I stood frozen. For a few seconds, it felt like someone had sucked all the air from the room. No wind, no footsteps. Only the sound of my heart crashing to the cold floor. I had to grip the doorframe just to stay standing. "Dad? What did you just say?" I asked, my voice shaking, barely more than a breath. Alexander didn't answer. He just shoved me by the shoulder and slammed the door in my face, like a sentence closing off the last hope I was clinging to. My whole body reeled from the push, and the heavy wooden door shut in front of me like it was sealing out all the light. I stood alone on the porch, the Seattle wind biting cold, and my heart beating faintly, like it was trying to survive the cruelest blow I'd ever known. I turned slowly back to my car, like a ghost ripped out of its own skin. Once I sat in the driver's seat, I didn't have the strength to start the engine. I just sat there, hands limp on the wheel, heart beating so slowly, I thought it might stop altogether. I sat in the car for nearly an hour, staring blankly down the dark street. And suddenly, the memory of the night my mother died began playing in reverse, like a film spool unraveling. I remembered I was 10 years old. I wasn't home that night. I was sleeping over at my grandparents' house. I remembered my grandfather's voice on the phone with my mom that afternoon. "Let her stay here. Don't leave her home with Alexander when he's drunk." I remembered my mom hugging me tight before she left, saying she'd come pick me up in the morning. I remember so clearly I wasn't with her that night. I was safe, curled up in an old blanket, while she worked her first ever overtime shift to earn money to fix the fence my dad had destroyed while drunk. I remember my grandfather waking me before dawn, his eyes red, and simply saying, "We have to go to the hospital." I don't remember what the hospital smelled like. I only remember my grandfather holding me tightly and saying, "It was an accident, Gianna. It wasn't your fault." Those words, I'd forgotten them for years, or thought I had. A few months after she passed, Grandpa called me out to the farm, the smell of early morning grass still fresh in my memory. He spoke with a calm voice that felt strange. "This farm, I'm leaving it to you, not your father." I remember asking, "Why me?" He placed a hand on my head gently. "You'll understand when you're older." Now, sitting in the dark car outside my father's house, I understood. At least part of it. Grandpa had seen something it took me over 30 years to realize. I took out my phone, hands trembling so badly I had to hold it with both, and called Aunt Anna, my mother's younger sister, the last person I could still trust. When she picked up and heard the break in my voice, she asked immediately, "Gianna, what happened?" I told her every word my father had shouted at me, every accusation, every warped memory. When I got to the line, "You're the reason your mother died," Aunt Anna nearly screamed, "No, absolutely not. Gianna, it wasn't your fault." She was gasping, and then continued in a voice thick with grief and fury. "Your mom confided in me the week before she died. Your dad had been unemployed for months, drinking every night. One night he got so drunk he broke the neighbor's fence. They demanded compensation. Your mom took an extra shift to pay the debt. That night was her first overtime. It wasn't because you wanted piano lessons. It wasn't because of you, Gianna. Not at all." I covered my mouth as tears fell uncontrollably. The weight my father had placed on my shoulders for years had never been true. "Gianna," my aunt whispered, like stitching shut the wound that had just torn open in my heart. "You were the one thing your mother never, ever regretted." I pressed my forehead to the steering wheel and cried like I never had before. But in the midst of those sobs, something else was forming. Something I didn't expect to still have. A cold, cutting clarity. Not rage, not heartbreak, but a silence so dangerous it only belongs to someone who no longer believes in anyone and trusts only in the truth. When I finally lifted my head, the tears had dried on my face. The pain was still there, but it no longer paralyzed me. It became fuel. I opened my phone, replayed the footage from hours ago. Christian standing up, Brittany walking in, Charles appearing. 3 people, one seamless plan. I saved everything in 3 places: my phone, a USB, and a private cloud. Then I started gathering every other piece of the puzzle. The visitor logs. Christian was only in pain when I was present. The camera's audio, laughter, whispers, and words that laid the whole scheme bare. Brittany's voice. "Once the farm's sold, we're good." Charles' words. "I've already edited the medical records." And then I remembered something that once seemed small. About a month ago, I had gotten a few calls from unknown numbers. I didn't pick up. They texted, "Your husband is late on payments. We're coming to your farm." Christian said he'd use his wife's property to pay. I had deleted the messages right away. I thought it was a scam, just another financial threat, like the news always warned about. I even joked to a colleague, "Scammers are getting creative these days." But now, putting it all together, I knew. It was all real. Christian was drowning in gambling debt. And this accident was his way of forcing me into a corner, to sell the farm my grandfather left me. I logged into our shared account and opened the transaction history from the past 3 months. Instantly, irregular charges popped up. Constant small withdrawals, transfers to anonymous accounts, temporary payments near casino districts. I opened Christian's email, something he always assumed I'd never look at. There, I found debt reminders, overdue warnings, payment requests from names I didn't even recognize. All debt. All hidden from me. I saved every single piece of evidence. And right after, I went back to Swedish Hospital. I opened the door to the hospital room with the face of a devoted wife. Not a flicker of suspicion, not a tremble, just the perfect amount of softness, exactly the way Christian and Brittany expected. I think, maybe I should do what everyone's been saying, I said, placing my hand on his shoulder. I'll sell the farm to take care of you. Christian looked at me, eyes flashing with a joy he didn't have time to hide. Brittany, standing at the foot of the bed, immediately chimed in. Smart move, Gianna. Do it soon. Prices are good right now. Her voice was full of concern, but her eyes lit up like someone who'd just won the lottery. I nodded, pretending to be fragile. I'm already contacting an agent, just waiting for the right price. Someone's interested. That part was half true, half a lie. I hadn't actually listed it. I just needed time. And I knew exactly how to make Christian panic, how to get him to push, how to make them slip up. That evening, I stepped into the hallway and called a real agent, just to ask for a price quote. I didn't sell. I just wanted to create a breadcrumb trail so that if Christian checked my phone, he'd think I truly intended to sell. With each passing day, Christian grew more anxious. Brittany pretended to care. Don't wait too long and let the market dip. Our family needs stability. Our family? I wanted to laugh, but I didn't. I just nodded, silently watching their every expression. Finally, I did something that chilled even me. I chose the exact moment I knew Christian's creditors would come to the hospital. This time, I didn't delete their messages. I replied with one line. He's at Swedish Hospital. If you want to meet, come tomorrow at 9 a.m. I turned off my phone, took a deep breath, and understood that I had just turned the hospital into a stage to expose 3 traitors in a single afternoon. I was no longer the Gianna from a few hours ago. No longer the woman backed into a corner, deceived, robbed of her mother, blamed for a lifetime. I was becoming something else, something Christian never saw coming, a woman who had walked through the abyss and had nothing left to lose. At exactly 9 a.m. the next morning, as I stood in the hallway on the 4th floor, hands steady on a cup of cold coffee, the stage I had been preparing for days finally began to open. 3 unfamiliar men entered the Swedish lobby, eyes sharp as steel, clothes dusty, but their demeanor purposeful. I recognized them instantly, not from any prior meeting, but because I knew this type. Real-world debt collectors, not the kind who send empty threats via text. They scanned the area, and one of them stepped up to the nurse's station, voice clipped and hard. Christian Doyle, what room is he in? The atmosphere shifted immediately. Tight, like a guitar string stretched to the point of snapping. I stood back, calmly watching like a doctor observing a patient's decline, and said one sentence loud enough for them to hear. Follow me. They did. No questions. No hesitation. As we turned into the hallway, leading to Christian's room, I saw my mother-in-law, several of Christian's relatives, and Alexander, my father, hurrying out of the elevator. I wasn't surprised. I knew who had called them. Brittany stood in the hallway, pretending to panic, tears streaming down her face, rushing over to cling to me like I was the last child she had left. Gianna, I'm so scared. They're here to collect Christian's debts. I don't know what's going on. She even tried to pull me into her arms like some kind stepmother, her voice trembling, eyes watery, but her shoulders didn't shake. People who fake fear too often forget that the body doesn't lie. Alexander stood behind her, face flushed from alcohol, but I saw the genuine confusion in his eyes. Maybe he didn't know what Brittany had done. Or maybe he knew but couldn't bring himself to admit it. I gently, firmly removed Brittany's hands from me. Let's go to Christian's room, I said, my voice so calm even I didn't recognize it. There's something we need to clear up, together. The hospital room was packed and stifling. Christian lay on the bed, eyes wide when he saw the debt collectors behind me. Brittany stood beside him, trying to pose protectively. Charles lingered in the corner, still clutching a medical chart, but the false confidence on his face was gone. I stood in the center, turned my phone toward everyone. Before we talk about debts, I want everyone to see this. No one objected. No one dared. I played the saved video. The screen lit up. The audio began. Christian stood up from the bed. Christian removed his leg braces. Christian walked, normally. Brittany entered the room. The two whispered, laughed close together. Christian said, "She's starting to worry. Push a little more." Brittany replied, "Once the farm's sold, we're good." Charles entered. "Keep the medical records consistent. Everything, clear, sharp, undeniable." No one in the room breathed. My mother-in-law covered her mouth, choking back a sound. One of the debt collectors muttered, "So you faked an injury to con your own wife?" Alexander looked at Brittany like she was a stranger, then turned to me, his eyes hollow, like he finally understood why I stood at his door last night looking broken. "And Christian?" He went pale, his body stiff like all his skin had been stripped away to expose the truth beneath. I stopped the video. In the dead silence of a crowded room, I looked at Christian and said the one line I had waited days to speak, without trembling. "This is the truth, and today you have to face it." As soon as I finished speaking, the room exploded into silence. Christian shot upright, faster than any bedridden patient should have moved, then immediately grabbed my hand like a drowning man grasping a twig. "Gianna, it's not what you think. I was forced. I'm in debt. I had no other choice." His voice trembled, not from pain, but from fear. But phrases like, "I was forced," "I owed money," "I didn't want this," meant nothing now. Everyone in the room had seen the video. Everyone knew he had stood, walked with ease, laughed, whispered a plan to deceive me. I pulled my hand back, gently but brutally. "Christian," I said quietly, but clearly, "you weren't forced. You made a choice." The moment I stepped back, Brittany collapsed to the floor like a felled tree. She knelt, clutching my pant leg, sobbing loudly, but her eyes held not a single trace of real remorse. "Gianna, I'm sorry. I just wanted to help Christian get through it. I got pulled in. I didn't mean to." She spoke as if she had accidentally tripped into a trap. Not the same woman who sat beside Christian at 3 a.m. and whispered, "Once the farm's sold, we're good." Alexander stood behind her, staring at Brittany with such bewilderment I'd never seen in him before. It was as if, for the first time in his life, he truly saw the woman he had blindly defended for 10 years. He opened his mouth to say something, but no sound came out. That look said everything. He didn't recognize the person in front of him anymore. Christian's family lined up by the left side of the bed. My mother-in-law raised her trembling hand to her lips, as if staring at a corpse reanimating into something monstrous. Just days ago, she had hugged Christian and cried over her disabled son. Now her eyes narrowed, not in grief, but in disgust. You deceived all of us?" she whispered, her voice strangled. And Charles, standing in the corner, trying to dodge every gaze, his face as pale as a patient chart. A staff doctor knocked on the door. "Dr. Charles, HR and the Ethics Committee request your presence immediately." No deliberation needed. No appeal. His career shattered on the spot, the very moment the video played. All the fake authority Charles once used to judge me, to shield Christian, fell to the floor like a bloodied lab coat. I looked at every face in the room, shocked, humiliated, exposed, hurt. Then I spoke, calm as if closing a long surgery. "I'm not here to cause a scene. I'm here to end the scam." The room sank into a heavy silence, the kind that settles when people witness a chain collapse they can no longer stop. The very next day, I left Swedish Hospital carrying a USB with all the evidence, a phone filled with Christian's gambling debt messages, and a heart completely detached from this marriage. I didn't wait a second longer. I went straight to King County Court and filed for divorce. I signed every page with a steady hand. I requested a protection order for my personal property, a freeze on any attempt by Christian to sell or touch the farm, and most importantly, legal confirmation that the farm was inheritance from my grandfather, not shared marital property. U.S. law is clear. Personal inheritance is not divided. Gambling debt and fraud-based obligations are personal liabilities. And I had the proof. I submitted the video of Christian walking unaided, the audio of Brittany whispering their plan to pressure me into selling, and the clip of Charles discussing how to keep the records consistent. Everything was time-stamped, cross-checked with nurse shift logs, undeniable. Christian's attorney couldn't argue. At the first hearing, Christian walked into the courtroom mentally wrecked, not from injury, but from having destroyed his own life. The court needed only 3 months to deliver its decision. Christian was charged with attempted fraud, first degree. He received 5 years probation due to being a first-time offender and cooperating with the investigation, along with mandatory financial fraud rehabilitation and full reimbursement of my legal costs. The worst part for Christian wasn't the suspended sentence. It was the look in his family's eyes at court. Disgusted, disappointed, colder than I'd ever seen directed at another person. Brittany, on the other hand, could no longer pretend. When the prosecutor concluded she was an accomplice, helping stage the fake injury, hiding debt, and willfully plotting to strip me of my property, she collapsed in her seat, as if all her bones had vanished. The court sentenced her to 4 years probation, 600 hours of mandatory community service, and a criminal record in the state system, meaning she was unlikely to get any respectable job for years. And Charles? The Washington State Medical Board didn't wait for a trial. The moment the video was submitted, his license was suspended indefinitely. Once the investigation confirmed his role in staging the injury, he was stripped of his medical license. The criminal court sentenced Charles to 3 years probation, community service in rehabilitation facilities, and mandatory enrollment in a medical ethics program, only after which he could petition to return to practice. The three who once schemed together to con me now stood on 3 separate legal paths, with one thing in common: none of them had a way back. As for me, I walked out of the courthouse with a divorce decree, the legal title to my grandfather's farm fully protected, and a heart strangely light, as if I had finally reclaimed the breath that had been stolen from me all this time. I knew exactly where I needed to go, where I had to return. And a few weeks later, I packed up everything, left Seattle, and drove back to Portland, to the place where my grandfather once said, "Here, you will always have a home." That wide stretch of land, the place where I used to run barefoot across the damp grass, where my mother once laughed as she watched me play, where my grandfather spent the final days of his life shielding me, had now become the place where I began again. I slowed down, breathed deeper, and opened a small pediatric dermatology clinic in the nearby town. Nothing flashy, no hospital pressure, just me, a few sweet little patients, and grateful parents who saw my care. One afternoon, as I was closing the clinic, I saw my father's old car pulling into the farm's gravel path. Alexander stepped out. No stench of alcohol, no cloudy gaze. He stood there, hesitating, like he wasn't sure I'd let him get close. I said nothing. I stood on the porch, waiting for him to find his words. "Gianna," his voice hoarse but sober. "I'm sorry." It wasn't a cheap apology, not a plea for me to come back. It was the kind of apology spoken by a man who had hit rock bottom and was trying to climb back one step at a time to become better. Alexander told me he had started rehab, that he joined a support group, returned to church, and had been volunteering weekly at an animal rescue shelter to make amends with life. I looked into his eyes that, for the first time in years, weren't glazed with liquor, but full of remorse, and I knew I couldn't hate him forever. But I also knew something even more important. I wouldn't go back to how things used to be. I told him I accepted his apology, but I set boundaries. We could rebuild, but only through real action, not promises. And he nodded, as if he understood that I was no longer the 8-year-old girl haunted by the words, "Your mother died because of you." In the days that followed, I often sat alone on the old wooden porch, looking out at the garden where my grandfather once sipped tea every morning. I remembered his words, "You'll understand when you're older." And now I did. He left me the farm not out of favoritism, not because he distrusted my father, but because he wanted me to have a way out, a place to survive when life threw at me truths too painful to imagine. And in this place, among wind-swept fields, I began to trust again. But not trust in others first. Not in love, or promises, or someone's gaze. I learned to trust myself. And this time, I knew I would never lose that trust again. About a month after my dermatology clinic in Portland officially opened, on a chilly morning, I arrived as usual and found a man already waiting at the door. He wore a designer coat, but stood next to a boy around 8, in a worn-out sweater with frayed shoulders. I assumed he was the child's uncle or cousin bringing him in for an appointment, so I simply smiled and opened the door for them. That whole visit, the man barely spoke. He just sat patiently beside the boy, helped him answer my questions, then paid and thanked me with a polite smile. I didn't think much of it, until a few days later, he returned, this time with a different girl, her coat older, her shoes too big. Then, a week later, another child. None of the kids looked alike, no shared features. And notably, all of them called him brother, not uncle, not dad. One quiet afternoon, with no patience, as I was jotting notes, he paused by my desk and spoke in a voice as soft as a confession. "I figured you've been wondering." I laughed, because I had been, and the story he shared left me speechless. His name was Michael, a tech entrepreneur. I realized then, I'd heard of him before, one of Portland's young millionaires. But what caught my attention wasn't his success. It was what he did. He ran a support group for single mothers in hardship. All the children he brought in were their kids. He personally drove them, arranged appointments, paid for treatments, without press, without applause, without seeking credit. He said, "My mother was a single mom. She did everything to raise me. Now I want to make sure other kids don't have to go through what I did. Helping them is how I'm healing myself." I looked at Michael then, not through the lens of wealth, but through the quiet strength of someone shaped by struggle, someone who had learned how to turn old wounds into kindness. We began talking more about work, children, my years at Harborview, my grandfather's farm. I found myself laughing more, speaking more gently, no longer as guarded as before. After all I'd endured, I thought my heart would stay closed for a long time, but it turned out it was just waiting for someone kind enough to knock with the right rhythm. A year later, on a late winter afternoon, as I was on shift at the clinic, Michael walked in with a nervous look I'd never seen on him. He asked me to come to the window and see how beautiful Portland winters can be. When I turned around, he was on one knee, ring box open, hand slightly trembling, eyes deep and full, like they wanted to say 1,000 things at once. He asked, "Will you let me take care of you, the way you've taken care of everyone else?" I didn't hesitate. Not because I was lonely, not because I needed someone to lean on. I said yes because for the first time in my life, I understood what love without conditions looked like. Love without schemes, without lies. A love born simply from real, quiet goodness. And right there, in my own clinic, I nodded. Softly but surely, as if my soul had finally found a place to rest. That's the whole story. A journey through betrayal, a rise from the place that once broke me, and finally, a life I never thought I deserved. Until I lived it. If you'd like to continue walking with me through more stories, please hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. It helps me keep sharing honest stories, stories meant for those who truly need to hear them.